Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about a certain way of motivating the Fregean view of the meaning of singular terms on the basis of communication. So, we'll be looking at a series of versions of Frege's puzzle that arise in with the communication involving singular terms. In this video, I will give you an overview of the lecture and do some review of a couple of things that both Frege and Russell said about communication. So first, as overview, in the required reading for today, Heck provides arguments against direct reference theory, and these arguments are based on insights about communication with singular terms. I begin the lecture with a review of what Frege and Russell said about communication, which I'll do in this video. We will then go over Heck's arguments and conclude with a discussion of how much these arguments really support Fregeanism, in addition to simply criticizing direct reference theory. So we'll see at the end that Fregeanism and direct reference theory are not the only views one could have about the meaning of singular terms, and that the arguments that Heck provides on the basis of communication are criticisms of direct reference theory, but don't necessarily directly support Fregeanism, as opposed to perhaps an alternative to both Fregeanism and direct reference theory. Okay, that's the plan for the lecture. And now in the rest of this video, let me review two insights or accounts of communication that can be drawn out from passages in the works of Frege and Russell. And this is review, since these passages are from supplementary readings from the first week. And I think in the first lecture, I presented these passages and briefly outlined the ideas in them. So let me do some review. So going back to the very first readings, these supplementary readings, which is Frege's paper, The Thought, and Russell's paper, Knowledge by Acquaintance and Knowledge by Description. In each of these we find passages which support two competing accounts of what's required or involved in understanding singular terms. So we can draw out these accounts from these passages and ask who was right or who was more right, since we'll see in this lecture and the next that perhaps both of these accounts are wrong. In any case, here is Frege's passage. So Frege writes, when Dr. Laubin has the thought that he was wounded, he will probably be basing it on the primitive way in which he is presented to himself. In this passage, Frege is discussing a person, Dr. Laubin, as an example. Now, who this person is doesn't matter. What matters is that we're considering someone who we're calling Dr. Laubin, and we're considering him thinking a thought about himself, that he himself is wounded. Now, Frege notes in this first sentence that this thought will involve a way of thinking of himself as a subject of that thought, which is a way of thinking which only he can think of himself under. So it's a first-personal way of thinking, or a first-personal sense. Okay, so only Dr. Laubin himself can grasp thoughts about himself in this first-personal sense. But now, Frege notes, if Dr. Laubin, so I'll continue reading it. Now, Dr. Laubin may want to communicate with others. He cannot communicate a thought he alone can grasp. Therefore, if he now says, I am wounded, he must use I, the word I, in a sense which can be grasped by others, perhaps in the sense of he who is speaking to you at this moment. So the idea here is that in order for there to be understanding of a sentence between two people, both those people must grasp the same sense. Okay? So if someone says, in this case, Dr. Laubin says, I am wounded, and if the sense that he expresses with that it involves a first personal way of thinking about himself, it can't be that someone he's talking to can also grasp that same sense. Okay? To note is not the particular example of I that Frege is using, but rather the kind of reasoning that Frege is making. And in particular, the implicit idea that Frege is appealing to, which is that the sense which is attached to expressions when there's understanding of them between two people has to be one that both people can grasp. And that is why Frege concludes here that the sense attached to the word I, when it's used in communication, cannot be the first personal way of thinking of oneself, because if it were, then there could not be communication. And the reason why there could not be communication is because Frege is presupposing that in successful communication, the interlocutors grasp the same sense, and so with regard to singular terms, the interlocutors must think of the referent in the same way. And that's why, again, Frege proposes that the sense of I in communication isn't the first personal way that someone thinks of themselves, but rather something else. For instance, the description, he who is speaking to you at this moment. For this way of thinking of an object is one which both the speaker and the hearer can grasp in thinking about the speaker. Okay, so here we have a particular case of an individual, Dr. Laubin, and particularly using the word I, but what's important to note about this passage is the implicit idea that in order for there to be successful communication with a singular term, that singular term must have a sense which both the speaker and the hearer both grasp. So again, successful communication requires that the interlocutors lock on to the same sense, or the same way of thinking of the referent of the singular term. Or again, successful communication requires that the interlocutors think of the referent in the same way. Now, there's a passage in Russell's work in which Russell suggests a different view of communication, and on this alternative view, Russell suggests that all that successful communication requires is that the interlocutors think of the same referent, and it doesn't matter whether the interlocutors think of the same referent in the same way or in different ways, so as long as the interlocutors think of the referent in some way. So here is quickly the passage which supports that view of communication. So Russell is using an example of an individual named Bismarck, who was a 19th century German diplomat. So this is a historical figure for whom Russell thinks that we are not able to have directly referential thoughts about. Okay, so this was again Russell's uh, view that proper names couldn't be genuine referring expressions. Okay, so because of Russell's idiosyncratic view, in which when we try to talk about individuals in history, we actually can't directly talk about them. Russell notes of this example that, for example, me and you talking about Bismarck, we cannot have directly referential thoughts about Bismarck. And this is because the actual Bismarck is unknown to us. So this is someone who lived long ago in history. And so we're not able to be acquainted with Bismarck in Russell's sense of acquaintance. And so what Russell says is that each person or each different group of people employs various different descriptions in order to think about this person, Bismarck. Okay, so again, this is just the description theory of proper names. So for me, for instance, I might associate a certain description with the name Bismarck. For instance, the most famous 19th century German diplomat. Okay, so that for me is the description, the definite description that stands behind my use of the name Bismarck. But for you or anyone else, they might have um, a different definite description, which helps them think about Bismarck. So, for example, you might not have heard of him before. So for you, you're just thinking of him under the description of the person, the instructor of this class is using as an example or something. Okay, so the point is just that you might have a different description under which you think of this person than me. And Russell says, and what Russell says here is that different people might employ different descriptions of the same person, Bismarck, but nonetheless, they are able to communicate successfully when they use the name Bismarck because each of their descriptions are in fact of the same person. So what Russell is suggesting here is that there can be successful communication with using a singular term. And all that involves is that the interlocutors think of the same referent. And it doesn't matter whether the interlocutors think of the same referent in different ways. For instance, employing different descriptions. All that matters for successful communication is that, in fact, in some way or other, the interlocutors are thinking of the same object. And this view of communication is in contrast again to what Frege suggests. And what Frege suggests, just to quickly repeat, is that it's not enough for successful communication that the interlocutors think of the same referent, full stop. Rather, what's involved is that the interlocutors think of the same referent in the same way. And that is Frege's stronger view of communication, which is opposed to what Russell suggests, which is that all that is involved is that the interlocutors think of the same referent in some way or another.